4 American tourists received devastating news in March 2023 that would reshape the entire debate over U.S. military action in Mexico. The group had traveled to the border town of Matamoros when Gulf Cartel gunmen kidnapped them, murdering 2 in a case of mistaken identity. The incident triggered something unprecedented. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham introduced legislation to lay the groundwork for deploying U.S. military force against Mexican cartels, marking a departure from traditional diplomatic approaches. What made this attack different from previous cartel violence against Americans? And why did it transform fringe military intervention ideas into mainstream policy proposals being seriously considered in Washington? The Breaking Point Incident. The details of what happened in Matamoros reveal why this particular incident crossed a threshold that previous cartel violence had not reached. 4 American tourists had traveled to the border town for medical procedures when Gulf Cartel gunmen kidnapped them in a case of mistaken identity, believing they were Haitian smugglers operating in cartel territory. 2 of the Americans were murdered during their captivity, while the other 2 survived the ordeal that lasted several days before Mexican authorities recovered them. What made this attack fundamentally different from previous incidents was not just the deliberate targeting of Americans, but the cartel's immediate recognition that they had crossed a line. Unlike previous cases where cartels had claimed confusion or denied responsibility, the Gulf Cartel quickly apprehended the alleged perpetrators and turned them over to Mexican authorities while issuing public apologies through intermediaries. This unprecedented response revealed the organization's understanding that killing American tourists would trigger consequences they were not prepared to face. The aftermath demonstrated how Gulf and Sinaloa cartels have grown increasingly brazen in their high-profile attacks on American citizens, showing a level of operational confidence that extends far beyond traditional criminal organizations. The Matamoros incident occurred in broad daylight in a border town where American medical tourists regularly travel, indicating that cartels no longer consider proximity to the United States border a deterrent to violent action. This brazenness reflected their evolution into quasi-military organizations capable of challenging both Mexican government forces and international boundaries. Republican leaders, who had previously approached cartel intervention with measured responses, immediately escalated their rhetoric following the confirmed deaths. Senator Lindsey Graham announced plans to introduce legislation that would lay the groundwork for the Biden administration to deploy military force against Mexican cartels, marking a significant departure from traditional diplomatic approaches to cross-border violence. This proposal represented the first serious congressional effort to authorize military intervention, specifically targeting cartel operations rather than supporting Mexican government efforts. The political transformation became evident as lawmakers who had spent years advocating for diplomatic solutions began acknowledging that traditional approaches had reached their limits. The incident provided concrete evidence that cartels were willing to kill Americans without regard for potential consequences, fundamentally altering the risk calculation that had previously kept military intervention off the table. Defense policy experts who had opposed military action against cartels started examining potential intervention scenarios, while former State Department officials began questioning whether diplomatic engagement could address organizations that operated with such impunity. Congressional offices reported unprecedented constituent pressure demanding military retaliation, with phone systems becoming overwhelmed in the days following the Matamoros murders. The public outcry reflected a growing perception that cartel violence had escalated beyond what law enforcement and diplomatic measures could effectively address. Polling conducted in the weeks after the incident showed dramatic increases in support for military action against cartels, with numbers reaching levels not seen since the immediate aftermath of major terrorist attacks. The families of the Matamoros victims became vocal advocates for stronger government response, meeting with key political figures and amplifying pressure for decisive action against the cartels. Their advocacy helped transform military intervention from a fringe position into mainstream policy discussion that included moderate Democrats and traditional foreign policy establishment figures. The personal testimonies of affected families provided emotional weight that abstract policy debates had previously lacked, creating sustained momentum for more aggressive measures. Social media. Amplification of the incident generated millions of shares across platforms, creating viral content that sustained public attention far longer than typical news cycles. The graphic nature of cartel violence, combined with the clear innocence of the victims, created emotional resonance that traditional diplomatic responses could not satisfy. Hashtags demanding military intervention maintained trending status for days, while online groups organizing protests outside Mexican diplomatic facilities grew rapidly in membership and activity. The Gulf Cartel's damage control efforts, including their unprecedented apology and handover of alleged perpetrators, failed to reduce political pressure for military retaliation. Many officials viewed the cartel's coordinated response as evidence of their organizational sophistication rather than genuine remorse, arguing that groups capable of such rapid damage control possessed the operational capacity to prevent such incidents in the first place. The cartel's ability to quickly identify and surrender suspects demonstrated command structures that resembled military organizations more than traditional criminal enterprises. The incident transformed political discourse around cartel violence, with phrases like act of war and terrorist attack entering mainstream vocabulary when discussing cross-border criminal activity. This linguistic shift reflected a fundamental change in how policymakers conceptualize the cartel crisis, moving it from the realm of law enforcement cooperation into the domain of national security, threats requiring military responses. The rhetorical escalation provided political cover for lawmakers who had previously avoided supporting military intervention. Think tanks that typically advocated for diplomatic solutions began producing policy papers examining potential military options, while academic institutions started hosting conferences on intervention scenarios that would have been considered fringe topics just months earlier. The intellectual infrastructure supporting military intervention expanded rapidly as the Matamoros incident provided concrete justification for theoretical frameworks that had previously lacked real-world applications. The transformation in elite opinion created conditions where military intervention proposals could receive serious consideration rather than immediate dismissal. Congressional committees began requesting briefings on cartel capabilities and potential military responses, while defense contractors started developing presentations on specialized equipment and tactics suited for anti-cartel operations. The policy apparatus that had focused exclusively on supporting Mexican government efforts began examining direct action scenarios. However, the Matamoros incident represented just one data point in a broader pattern of escalating violence that was reaching historic proportions across Mexico. 2025's unprecedented death toll. Mexican government statistics revealed a staggering scale of violence that has made military intervention discussions inevitable. Official reports document over 30,000 homicides annually since 2018, with cartel-related violence accounting for approximately 78% of all deaths, according to preliminary analysis from the National Institute of Statistics and Geography. The states of Guanajuato, Baja California, and Michoacan continue leading in absolute numbers. But the most alarming trend has been the spread of extreme violence into previously stable regions where homicide rates have increased dramatically compared to previous years. Disappearances have reached catastrophic levels that dwarf even the official homicide statistics, with Mexican authorities acknowledging thousands of new cases of forced disappearance each year. The National Registry of Disappeared Persons now contains over 130,000 active cases, but human rights organizations estimate the true number exceeds 200,000 when accounting for families who never report missing relatives due to fear of cartel retaliation. Forensic investigators continue discovering clandestine burial sites containing the remains of thousands of individuals, while the backlog of unidentified bodies in morgues across Mexico has grown to over 52,000 cases. American fentanyl deaths have created an unprecedented crisis, with the CDC reporting 107,000 overdose deaths in 2022, of which 70% were fentanyl-related. Despite provisional data showing a 26.9% drop in U.S. overdose deaths in 2024, The Drug Enforcement Administration confirmed that the Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels control 70% of seized drugs entering the United States. The DEA has confirmed that 94% of street fentanyl samples tested positive for additives that increase potency and addiction potential, with new synthetic compounds appearing monthly that existing treatment protocols cannot address effectively. Cartel territorial expansion has accelerated dramatically as organizations exploit weakened government control in regions devastated by ongoing violence. U.S. military estimates indicate that cartels now control approximately one-third of Mexican territory and command combined forces of 160,000 to 185,000 armed fighters. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel now maintains operational presence in the majority of Mexico states, while the Sinaloa Cartel has consolidated control over critical Pacific Coast infrastructure, including major ports. Intelligence assessments indicate that cartels now exercise de facto governmental authority over vast territories, collecting taxes from businesses, operating their own justice systems, and providing basic services that official government cannot deliver. The correlation between expanded cartel control and American drug deaths has become undeniable as territories under cartel administration have become primary production and distribution hubs for fentanyl destined for United States markets. Mexican military intelligence reports that areas with highest cartel territorial control produce significantly more illicit fentanyl than regions where government maintains authority, while shipping routes from cartel-controlled ports account for the majority of precursor chemicals entering Mexico from Chinese suppliers. Border interdiction data shows that most fentanyl seizures occur at crossing points adjacent to territories where cartels maintain complete operational control, indicating the direct relationship between territorial dominance and drug trafficking capacity. Economic devastation has reached levels that threaten the fundamental stability of legitimate Mexican commerce, as cartel extortion networks have expanded beyond traditional targets to encompass virtually every sector of the economy. Financial Times estimates reveal that cartels launder millions of dollars into Mexican political systems, while thousands of companies have permanently ceased operations due to cartel pressure. Agricultural exports to the United States have declined significantly as farmers in cartel-controlled regions abandon their crops rather than pay protection fees that consume most profits, while manufacturing operations in northern Mexico report production delays that have cost American companies billions in lost revenue. Cartel recruitment has reached industrial scale, with the organizations now commanding combined forces that rival the size of many national armies. Major cartels reportedly maintain tens of thousands of active combatants organized into military-style units with specialized roles including reconnaissance, logistics, communications, and assault operations. Recruitment has expanded beyond traditional sources as cartels now actively recruit former military personnel, police officers, and even teenagers through social media campaigns that promise salaries exceeding what legitimate employers can offer in cartel-controlled territories. Military capabilities of major cartels have evolved far beyond simple criminal organizations into sophisticated paramilitary forces that possess equipment and training comparable to national military units in smaller countries. Intelligence reports confirm that cartels have acquired advanced weaponry, armored vehicles, sophisticated communication equipment capable of monitoring government frequencies, and drone technology for both surveillance and offensive operations. The Sinaloa Cartel operates training facilities where recruits receive instruction in urban warfare, explosives handling, and counter-surveillance techniques from former Mexican military personnel and international mercenaries with combat experience. Production infrastructure has reached industrial scale as cartels operate over 1,200 confirmed fentanyl production facilities across Mexico, with new laboratories discovered weekly by Mexican authorities who lack resources to shut down operations faster than they can be established. The Sinaloa Cartel dominates Mexico's Pacific port of Mazatlan, through which they import large quantities of precursor chemicals necessary for fentanyl production from China, according to Drug Enforcement Administration Administrator N. Milgram. Laboratory seizures have yielded equipment capable of producing massive quantities of pure fentanyl annually, enough to supply American markets for extended periods. These mounting statistics have provided intervention advocates in Washington with overwhelming evidence to support their arguments for military action, as traditional law enforcement approaches have proven completely inadequate against organizations that possess military-grade capabilities and territorial control. Congressional briefings now routinely feature presentations comparing cartel capabilities to those of recognized terrorist organizations, while Pentagon assessments classify major cartels as near-peer adversaries that require military rather than law enforcement responses. The transformation of these criminal organizations into quasi-military forces controlling vast territories has created conditions where traditional diplomatic and law enforcement approaches appear increasingly insufficient, setting the stage for more aggressive policy considerations from incoming political leadership. Trump's return and the new war cabinet. Donald Trump's return to the presidency has fundamentally transformed the approach to cartel intervention, as his new administration assembled a team of appointees who view military action as not just viable, but necessary for addressing the crisis. Within weeks of taking office, Trump installed officials across key agencies who had previously advocated for direct military strikes against cartel targets, creating an unprecedented level of coordination between departments that had historically operated with conflicting priorities regarding Mexico policy. The administration's accelerated timeline for military planning became evident as intelligence briefings shifted from monthly assessments to daily strategy sessions focused specifically on operational capabilities against cartel infrastructure. Ronald Johnson, Trump's choice for ambassador to Mexico, represents this hawkish shift as a former Green Beret and CIA officer whose background in sensitive paramilitary operations signals the administration's intention to treat cartel intervention as a military rather than diplomatic challenge. Johnson's appointment broke with decades of tradition where ambassadors to Mexico typically came from diplomatic or academic backgrounds, instead installing someone whose expertise lies in covert operations and targeted elimination of hostile forces. His confirmation hearings revealed his belief that cartels represent military threats requiring military solutions, stating that traditional diplomatic engagement had proven completely inadequate for addressing organizations that possess Army-level capabilities and territorial control. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has repeatedly refused to rule out drone strikes and other military actions against Mexican cartels, even without Mexican government consent, marking a dramatic departure from previous Pentagon positions that emphasized cooperation with Mexican authorities. Hegseth's public statements have consistently framed cartel operations as acts of war against American citizens, arguing that the United States possesses inherent rights to defend its population against foreign threats regardless of their location or the host country's preferences. His background as a combat veteran who served in Iraq and Afghanistan has informed his assessment that cartels represent asymmetric warfare threats that require decisive military responses rather than prolonged diplomatic negotiations. Internal administration debates have emerged between aggressive intervention advocates led by Sebastian Gorka, Trump's senior director for counterterrorism, and more cautious voices represented by Stephen Miller, Trump's Homeland Security advisor, who worries that unilateral military action could jeopardize cooperation on migration and border security issues. Gorka's faction argues that cartel violence has reached levels that justify immediate military intervention under existing legal authorities, while Miller's group emphasizes the potential for Mexican retaliation that could worsen border security challenges and disrupt essential cooperation agreements. These internal tensions have played out in National Security Council meetings, where competing factions present conflicting assessments of intervention risks and benefits. Military preparations have accelerated significantly since Trump's inauguration, as surveillance flights along the southern border and Mexico's Pacific coast have increased from occasional reconnaissance missions to systematic intelligence gathering operations conducted almost daily. The U.S. military has conducted more than 24 known surveillance flights using spy planes and drones that previously were deployed primarily for monitoring activities in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. In early February, a U.S. Air Force RC-135V reconnaissance aircraft flew deep within the Gulf of California near Sinaloa, home to one of Mexico's most powerful cartels, representing the most aggressive intelligence operation conducted over Mexican territory in recent memory. Trump's previous presidency experiences have shaped his current approach as he demonstrated willingness to authorize dramatic military actions, including airstrikes against Syria and the drone strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, establishing precedents for unilateral military action that his current team references when discussing cartel intervention options. During his first term, Trump allegedly asked Defense Secretary Mark Esper whether the military could fire missiles at cartel-run drug labs and deny responsibility, indicating his early interest in covert operations that could avoid diplomatic complications. His authorization of targeted killings in multiple countries during his first presidency has created institutional memory within the military and intelligence communities that such operations can be conducted successfully without congressional approval. Coordination between the CIA, DEA, and Pentagon has reached unprecedented levels as agencies that previously operated with limited information sharing now participate in daily intelligence briefings focused exclusively on cartel targeting and operational planning. The CIA has expanded its presence in Mexico through diplomatic cover positions, while the DEA has shifted resources from traditional law enforcement activities to intelligence gathering that supports potential military operations. Pentagon planners have integrated DEA intelligence about cartel operations with CIA assessments of Mexican government capabilities to develop comprehensive targeting packages that could be implemented within hours of receiving authorization. Trump's relationship with military leaders has evolved as he has surrounded himself with officers who share his assessment that cartel violence represents an existential threat requiring military responses rather than diplomatic solutions. Unlike his first presidency, where military leaders often urged caution regarding foreign interventions, Trump's current team includes generals and admirals who view cartel operations as direct attacks on American national security that justify military retaliation. These officers have participated in classified briefings where they presented assessments comparing cartel capabilities to those of recognized terrorist organizations and hostile nation states. Operational plans under active consideration include targeted drone strikes against cartel leadership figures identified through intelligence gathering operations, with targeting packages already developed for high-value individuals whose elimination could disrupt major trafficking operations. Special operations forces have received briefings about potential raid scenarios in urban Mexican environments where cartel leaders maintain fortified compounds that would require sophisticated military capabilities to penetrate. The administration has also considered broader military operations designed to disrupt cartel infrastructure, including production facilities, transportation networks, and financial operations that support their activities. The administration's approach represents a fundamental shift from treating cartels as law enforcement challenges to recognizing them as military threats that require military solutions, with planning activities now focused on when rather than whether military intervention will occur. Intelligence officials report that the administration has requested accelerated timelines for operational planning that could support military action within weeks rather than months of receiving final authorization. However, before any military operations could commence, the administration needed to establish the legal framework that would justify such unprecedented action against organizations operating within the territory of a neighboring sovereign nation. The Trump administration crossed a legal threshold in February 2025 that fundamentally changed the entire framework for addressing Mexican cartels when it formally designated 6 major organizations as foreign terrorist organizations under the Immigration and Nationality Act. This designation placed the Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Northeast Cartel, Los Zetas Gulf Cartel, and La Familia Michoacana in the same legal category as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah, creating unprecedented authorities for American agencies to pursue these organizations through methods previously reserved for international terrorist groups. The State Department announcement emphasized that these cartels had evolved beyond traditional criminal enterprises into paramilitary organizations that pose direct threats to American national security through their systematic violence and chemical warfare against American civilians via fentanyl distribution. The Sinaloa cartel received particular attention in the designation documents as the organization responsible for the largest share of fentanyl entering American markets, with intelligence assessments indicating they control approximately 40% of all illicit drug trafficking between Mexico and the United States. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel earned its designation based on its rapid territorial expansion and sophisticated military capabilities, including surface-to-air missiles and armored vehicles that rival equipment possessed by some national armies. The Northeast Cartel's inclusion reflected its dominance over key border crossing points in Tamaulipas, where the majority of fentanyl shipments enter Texas, while Los Zetas received designation due to their systematic use of torture and psychological warfare tactics against civilian populations. This designation represents a complete departure from decades of American policy that treated cartels as criminal organizations subject to law enforcement rather than military responses, even when their violence exceeded that of many recognized terrorist groups. Previous administrations had consistently refused to apply terrorist designations to cartels despite their use of car bombs, mass kidnappings, and systematic torture because their primary motivation appeared financial rather than ideological. The Trump administration's decision broke this precedent by arguing that cartels' systematic targeting of American civilians through fentanyl distribution constitutes chemical warfare that justifies treating them as terrorist organizations regardless of their underlying motivations. The Foreign Terrorist Organization designation unlocks an extensive array of financial warfare capabilities that allow American authorities to freeze assets, block transactions, and criminally prosecute anyone who provides material support to designated organizations. Banks operating in both countries now face potential criminal liability for processing transactions that involve designated cartel members or their business associates, creating compliance nightmares for financial institutions that serve Mexican markets. The Treasury Department can now impose secondary sanctions on foreign banks that maintain correspondent relationships with Mexican institutions suspected of handling cartel finances, effectively cutting those banks off from the American financial system entirely. American companies operating in Mexico face unprecedented legal risks, as the designation makes it a federal crime to provide any goods or services that could be construed as material support to designated organizations, even if such support occurs unknowingly or through legitimate business activities. Manufacturing companies that operate in cartel-controlled territories may find themselves subject to federal prosecution if they pay taxes or fees to local authorities who share revenue with cartel organizations. Agricultural exporters who purchase products from farms and regions where cartels collect protection money could face criminal charges for indirectly funding terrorist organizations through their normal business operations. Mexican businesses across all sectors now confront the possibility of being cut off from American markets and financial systems if they maintain any connections to designated cartels, regardless of whether such connections are voluntary or the result of extortion and coercion. The designation effectively forces Mexican companies to choose between operating in cartel-controlled territories where they face violence for non-compliance with cartel demands, or maintaining access to American markets that provide essential revenue for their survival. Payment processors, including PayPal, have already begun restricting services in certain Mexican regions, similar to their withdrawal from the West Bank following Hamas's terrorist designation. The designation creates legal precedents that authorize military action against designated organizations without requiring congressional approval or Mexican government consent, as the president possesses inherent authority to defend American citizens against terrorist threats regardless of their location. This legal framework eliminates the traditional requirement for host nation approval that has historically constrained American military operations, allowing for drone strikes, special operations raids, and other military activities based solely on presidential authorization. The precedent established by previous administrations targeted killings of terrorist leaders in Pakistan, Yemen, and other countries now applies to cartel leadership operating in Mexico. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum responded to the designations by condemning them as violations of Mexican sovereignty and threatening to impose retaliatory economic measures against American companies operating in Mexico if military action follows. Her administration announced plans to review all cooperation agreements with American law enforcement agencies and indicated that intelligence sharing could be suspended if the United States proceeds with unilateral military operations. The Mexican Congress passed a resolution declaring that any American military action on Mexican territory would constitute an act of war that would require Mexico to suspend all bilateral treaties and cooperation agreements. The legal foundation created by these designations now supports military operations that administration officials describe as inevitable rather than potential, with targeting packages already developed for high-value cartel leaders whose elimination could be authorized without additional legal justification. Intelligence briefings for congressional leadership have emphasized that the terrorist designations provide sufficient legal authority for immediate military action if the president determines that American national security requires such measures. The terrorist designation represents the final legal obstacle that had previously prevented military intervention, but the operational groundwork for such action had already been under development for months through extensive intelligence gathering operations that few Americans realize have been taking place. Intelligence operations already underway. CIA surveillance drones have been conducting systematic flights over Mexican territory since October 2024, with operations now occurring almost daily over regions where major cartels maintain production facilities and operational headquarters. These surveillance missions represent a dramatic expansion of American intelligence activities in Mexico, far exceeding previous cooperation agreements that limited such operations to border regions and required explicit Mexican government approval for each flight. The drone program has grown from occasional reconnaissance missions to comprehensive intelligence gathering operations that monitor cartel activities across multiple Mexican states, with particular focus on Sinaloa, Jalisco, and Michoacan, where the most powerful organizations maintain their primary operational centers. The CIA has deployed sophisticated surveillance drones typically reserved for counterterrorism operations in the Middle East and Afghanistan, including General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper drones equipped with advanced sensor packages capable of conducting signals intelligence, communications intercepts, and high-resolution imagery collection from altitudes that make detection extremely difficult. These drones can remain airborne for over 14 hours and possess the capability to monitor multiple targets simultaneously while transmitting real-time intelligence back to analysts at CIA facilities in Virginia and Texas. The technology being employed includes synthetic aperture radar that can penetrate cloud cover and darkness, infrared sensors that detect heat signatures from chemical production processes, and electronic warfare capabilities that can intercept cartel communications. Military reconnaissance flights along Mexico's borders and Pacific coastline have increased dramatically, with over 24 documented surveillance missions conducted by various spy planes and specialized reconnaissance aircraft since Trump returned to office. The most significant of these operations occurred in early February when a U.S. Air Force RC-135V Rivet Joint Reconnaissance aircraft flew deep within the Gulf of California near Sinaloa, marking the most aggressive intelligence penetration of Mexican airspace in recent memory. This particular flight gathered electronic intelligence on cartel communications networks and identified key infrastructure, including airstrips, safe houses, and production facilities that could serve as potential targets for future military operations. These reconnaissance missions employ aircraft with capabilities that far exceed standard surveillance, including the RC-135V Rivet Joint, which specializes in intercepting enemy communications and electronic signals, the E-8 Joint Stars aircraft that provides ground surveillance and battle management capabilities, and high-altitude U-2 spy planes that can photograph entire regions with resolution sufficient to identify individual vehicles and personnel. The intelligence gathered from these flights is being compiled into comprehensive targeting packages that include detailed maps of cartel facilities, leadership locations, and operational patterns that would be essential for conducting precision military strikes. Cooperation with Mexican authorities regarding these intelligence operations has become increasingly strained as American agencies have shifted from collaborative intelligence sharing to unilateral collection activities that often proceed without Mexican knowledge or consent. Mexican military officials have privately expressed frustration that CIA drone flights occur over their territory without advance notification, while Mexican intelligence agencies report being excluded from planning and analysis of intelligence gathered by American operations. The tension has escalated as Mexican authorities suspect that intelligence officially shared for cooperative law enforcement purposes is being retained and analyzed for potential military targeting rather than traditional criminal investigations. Intelligence sharing agreements between the United States and Mexico have been fundamentally modified to support potential military operations rather than traditional law enforcement cooperation, with American agencies now classifying much of their intelligence collection under national security rather than criminal justice authorities. Previous agreements that required intelligence to be shared equally between both countries have been superseded by new frameworks that allow American agencies to retain sensitive targeting information while providing Mexican authorities only with general intelligence that supports their law enforcement activities. These modified agreements reflect the administration's recognition that full intelligence sharing could compromise future military operations if Mexican officials with cartel connections gain access to American targeting plans. Human intelligence networks within cartel territories have expanded significantly as CIA operatives recruit sources among cartel members, Mexican military personnel, and civilian populations in regions under cartel control. These networks provide real-time intelligence on cartel leadership movements, operational planning, and internal conflicts that technical surveillance cannot capture, with particular focus on identifying opportunities for targeted elimination of high-value targets. The CIA has established safe houses and communication networks that allow sources to report intelligence without detection by cartel security operations, while also providing financial incentives that exceed what cartels typically pay their own personnel. Mexican military and police cooperation in intelligence gathering efforts has become increasingly compartmentalized as American agencies work only with carefully vetted personnel who have been cleared through extensive background investigations designed to identify potential cartel infiltration. The appointment of Ronald Johnson, a former Green Beret and CIA officer, as ambassador to Mexico reflects the administration's intention to treat intelligence cooperation as a military rather than diplomatic function, with Johnson uniquely positioned to develop operational partnerships while mitigating counterintelligence risks from cartel-affiliated officials. This intelligence is being systematically compiled to map cartel leadership structures and operational centers with precision that rivals targeting packages developed for counterterrorism operations in Iraq and Syria, including detailed analysis of command relationships, financial networks, and operational vulnerabilities that could be exploited through targeted strikes. Intelligence analysts have identified key nodes within cartel organizations whose elimination could cause maximum disruption to their operations, while also mapping backup leadership structures that would need to be targeted simultaneously to prevent rapid organizational recovery. The speed and comprehensiveness of these intelligence operations mirror the early stages of previous American military interventions, with systematic target development and operational planning proceeding on timelines that suggest military action is being treated as inevitable rather than potential. Intelligence briefings for senior administration officials now focus on operational details rather than policy options, while targeting packages are being updated daily to reflect real-time intelligence on cartel activities and leadership locations. These extensive intelligence operations have created the informational foundation necessary for sustained military operations against cartel targets, placing enormous pressure on Mexico's leadership to navigate between American demands for expanded cooperation and their nation's sovereignty concerns. Mexico's new president under pressure. President Claudia Sheinbaum finds herself navigating an impossible position as she attempts to balance American demands for expanded cooperation against Mexican cartels while protecting the national sovereignty that defines her political party's core identity and public support base. Her administration faces relentless pressure from Washington to authorize American military operations on Mexican territory, while simultaneously confronting domestic political forces that view any accommodation of foreign intervention as betrayal of Mexico's hard-won independence from outside interference. The delicate equilibrium she must maintain has become increasingly unstable as American intelligence operations expand and military preparations accelerate, forcing her to make decisions that could determine whether Mexico maintains its sovereignty or becomes the theater for America's next military intervention. Sheinbaum's policy approach represents a calculated departure from her predecessor Andrés Manuel López Obrador's strategy of avoiding direct confrontation with cartel organizations through social programs and negotiated truces that many critics viewed as capitulation to criminal control. Her administration has implemented what officials describe as a more aggressive stance toward cartel operations, including increased military deployments and high-profile arrests of cartel leadership figures that signal a willingness to engage in direct confrontation with criminal organizations. However, these policy changes have produced mixed results, as violence levels have actually increased in several regions where government forces have challenged cartel territorial control, leading to criticism that her approach has destabilized existing arrangements without achieving meaningful security improvements. The domestic political pressures confronting Sheinbaum's administration have intensified dramatically as Mexican citizens demand both protection from cartel violence and defense against American military intervention, threats that many view as equally dangerous to Mexican national interests. Public opinion polls consistently show that while Mexicans want their government to address cartel violence more effectively, they overwhelmingly oppose allowing American military forces to operate on Mexican territory under any circumstances. Her Morena party faces internal divisions between factions that favor expanded cooperation with American anti-cartel efforts and traditionalists who view any accommodation of foreign military presence as political suicide that would destroy the party's nationalist credentials. Military deployment strategies implemented by Sheinbaum's government have emphasized repositioning National Guard units and regular military forces to regions where cartel violence has reached critical levels. But these deployments have achieved limited success in reducing overall violence while creating new tensions with American intelligence operations. The National Guard, which was transferred to military control just before López Obrador left office, now operates in coordination with regular Army units in joint operations that target cartel infrastructure and leadership positions. However, these operations have sometimes interfered with American intelligence gathering activities, creating friction between Mexican forces and CIA operatives who require operational space for their surveillance and targeting missions. The diplomatic balancing act Sheinbaum must perform has become increasingly complex as she attempts to provide sufficient cooperation to prevent American military intervention while maintaining enough independence to preserve Mexican sovereignty and domestic political support. Her administration has established private communication channels with American officials that allow for coordination on specific operations while maintaining public positions that emphasize Mexican independence and rejection of foreign intervention. These private negotiations have produced tactical agreements that allow American intelligence operations to continue in exchange for advanced notification of major military movements and shared intelligence on cartel activities that pose immediate threats to Mexican security. Specific agreements regarding CIA operations and intelligence sharing have evolved into complex arrangements that officially limit American activities while providing unofficial accommodation for expanded surveillance and targeting operations. Sheinbaum's administration has formally protested American drone flights over Mexican territory while privately establishing protocols that allow such operations to continue with reduced visibility and minimal public acknowledgement. Intelligence sharing agreements now provide American agencies with access to Mexican military intelligence on cartel operations while restricting the flow of sensitive information that could compromise Mexican security operations or reveal the extent of cooperation between the two governments. Anti-cartel operations conducted by Sheinbaum's government have produced significant arrests and seizures that demonstrate enhanced cooperation with American intelligence while maintaining the appearance of independent Mexican law enforcement action. Her administration has captured several high-value cartel targets whose locations were identified through American intelligence operations, including the arrest of 3 major cartel leaders in January 2025 that resulted from coordinated surveillance efforts. However, these successes have also triggered increased cartel violence as criminal organizations respond to government pressure by escalating attacks against civilian populations and government forces, creating a cycle of violence that undermines the political benefits of cooperation with American operations. Economic pressures facing Mexico have fundamentally influenced Sheinbaum's approach to cooperation with American anti-cartel efforts, as her government recognizes that trade relationships worth hundreds of billions of dollars depend on maintaining acceptable levels of cooperation with American security demands. The threat of American tariffs and trade restrictions has created powerful incentives for accommodation even when such cooperation conflicts with Mexican sovereignty principles and domestic political preferences. Her administration has calculated that limited cooperation with American intelligence operations represents a necessary compromise to prevent more damaging economic consequences that could result from complete non-cooperation with American anti-cartel efforts. Historical Mexican sovereignty concerns rooted in centuries of foreign intervention have shaped Sheinbaum's approach as she attempts to provide cooperation that satisfies American demands without triggering nationalist backlash that could destabilize her government and Mexican democracy. Mexico's historical experience with American military interventions, including the 1847 invasion that resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory and the 1916 Pershing expedition that pursued Pancho Villa across the border, creates powerful political and emotional resistance to any accommodation of foreign military presence. Sheinbaum has stated that Mexico would categorically reject any unilateral U.S. military action in Mexico, emphasizing that such action would not resolve anything, while proposing constitutional reforms aimed at strengthening protections for Mexican national sovereignty. Private negotiations between Mexican and American officials have focused on establishing limits for American military intervention that could allow for targeted operations while preventing full-scale military occupation that would trigger complete breakdown of bilateral relationships. These discussions have explored scenarios where American military action could occur with minimal Mexican government involvement, including possibilities for American forces to conduct operations in remote regions with minimal Mexican presence or to target specific cartel leaders whose elimination would benefit Mexican security interests. However, these negotiations have also revealed fundamental disagreements about the scope and duration of any American military operations, with Mexican officials insisting on strict limitations that American planners view as inadequate for achieving meaningful disruption of cartel operations. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the pressure facing Sheinbaum's administration continues to intensify as American military preparations accelerate beyond the point where accommodation may satisfy Washington's demands for decisive action. The military options on the table. Pentagon planners have developed 3 primary military strategies for operations against Mexican cartels that range from limited targeted strikes to comprehensive campaigns designed to systematically dismantle cartel infrastructure across multiple Mexican states. The first strategy focuses on precision elimination of high-value targets through drone strikes and special operations raids that would decapitate cartel leadership while minimizing broader military engagement. The second approach involves sustained air campaigns against cartel production facilities, training camps, and logistical networks that would cripple their operational capabilities without requiring significant ground forces. The third strategy encompasses comprehensive military operations that would establish temporary operational zones in cartel-controlled territories where American forces could conduct extended counterinsurgency operations similar to those employed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Drone strike capabilities being developed specifically for cartel leadership elimination utilize the same MQ-9 Reaper platforms that have conducted targeted killings across multiple continents, but with modifications designed for operations in Mexico's diverse terrain and urban environments. These drones carry Hellfire missiles with reduced explosive yields to minimize civilian casualties in densely populated areas where cartel leaders often operate, while maintaining sufficient lethality to eliminate targets in fortified compounds. Targeting procedures require multiple intelligence confirmations of target identity and location, with kill chains that can be executed within minutes of receiving actionable intelligence on high-value cartel leaders whose movements are being tracked through extensive surveillance networks. The drone program has established forward operating bases in Texas and Arizona that position aircraft within striking distance of cartel territories in northern Mexico, while mobile command centers can direct operations from locations that provide optimal communication links with surveillance assets and targeting intelligence. Operational planners have identified over 200 potential targets, including cartel leaders, operational commanders, and technical specialists, whose elimination could significantly disrupt trafficking operations. The targeting process requires confirmation through multiple intelligence sources, including signals intelligence, human sources, and visual identification before strikes can be authorized, with particular emphasis on avoiding civilian casualties that could generate political backlash. Special Forces raid options have been developed for urban Mexican environments, where cartel leaders maintain fortified compounds that require ground assault capabilities rather than air strikes that might cause excessive collateral damage. These operations would utilize Navy SEAL teams, Army Delta Force units, and specialized CIA paramilitary officers who possess experience conducting similar raids in hostile urban environments across multiple theaters. The raids would be conducted primarily at night using helicopters that can insert and extract teams rapidly while avoiding extended ground engagement with cartel forces or Mexican military units that might respond to incursions. Planning for urban raids recognizes that cartel compounds often include civilian populations, including family members and coerced workers, who must be protected during operations, requiring specialized training and equipment designed for precision operations in complex environments. Teams would employ advanced night vision systems, breaching charges calibrated for specific building types common in Mexico, and non-lethal weapons for controlling civilian populations during operations. Intelligence packages for each potential raid include detailed floor plans of target compounds, identification of civilian areas to be avoided, and escape routes that minimize contact with local security forces. Rules of engagement being developed address civilian casualty concerns by establishing strict protocols for target identification and verification that exceed standards typically applied in conventional warfare environments. Military personnel would be required to positively identify targets as cartel combatants rather than civilians before engaging, with particular protections for women, children, and elderly individuals who might be present in operational areas. The rules also establish procedures for handling Mexican military or police forces who might interfere with operations, emphasizing de-escalation and avoidance rather than confrontation with Mexican government forces. These engagement rules recognize that cartel operations often occur in civilian areas, including residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, and agricultural regions, where distinguishing combatants from non-combatants requires extensive training and sophisticated identification procedures. Military personnel would receive specialized training on Mexican civilian clothing, cultural practices, and behavioral patterns that could help identify legitimate targets, while avoiding mistakes that could escalate conflicts or generate international criticism. Intelligence requirements for successful operations include real-time surveillance capabilities that can track target movements, identify security arrangements around cartel facilities, and provide advance warning of Mexican government responses that could interfere with operations. Current capability gaps include insufficient human intelligence sources within cartel organizations and limited ability to monitor cartel communications that increasingly use encrypted messaging systems. Military planners have identified needs for enhanced signals intelligence capabilities and expanded recruitment of human sources who can provide actionable intelligence on cartel leadership locations and operational planning. Timeline considerations for different operations range from immediate drone strikes that could be executed within hours of target identification to complex special forces raids that require weeks of preparation and intelligence gathering. Military planners have developed flexible timelines that allow for rapid response to time-sensitive targets while maintaining capabilities for sustained operations that could continue for months depending on political authorization and operational effectiveness. Contingency planning addresses scenarios where Mexican authorities attempt to interfere with American operations through diplomatic protests, economic retaliation, or direct military intervention to protect their sovereignty. Cartel retaliation scenarios include increased attacks against American citizens in Mexico, escalated drug trafficking operations, and potential terrorist attacks against American targets. Military planners have developed response protocols for each scenario, including procedures for protecting American citizens and interests while maintaining operational momentum. Military leaders consider targeted drone strikes against cartel leadership the most viable option for immediate implementation because they require minimal resources, can be conducted with existing capabilities, and offer the greatest chance of achieving meaningful disruption of cartel operations while minimizing political and diplomatic complications that broader military operations would create. However, these operational plans have been developed based on intelligence assessments that may have significantly underestimated the military capabilities that cartel organizations have acquired over years of territorial expansion and arms accumulation. The cartel arsenal and capabilities. Intelligence assessments reveal that Mexican cartels have transformed into sophisticated paramilitary organizations possessing military-grade weaponry that fundamentally alters calculations for any potential American military intervention. These criminal organizations now command arsenals that include belt-fed Gatling guns, armored personnel carriers, and custom-manufactured tank contraptions that cartel members refer to as narco-tanks, representing military capability that exceeds what many legitimate national armies possess. The sophistication of cartel weaponry has consistently surprised American intelligence assessments, forcing Pentagon planners to revise operational strategies and threat assessments to account for adversaries who possess capabilities typically associated with conventional military forces rather than criminal enterprises. The acquisition of anti-aircraft and anti-tank systems by major cartel organizations has created unprecedented challenges for American military planners who must now account for threats that could neutralize standard military platforms and tactics employed in other intervention scenarios. Mexican authorities seized a heat-seeking FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missile from Sinaloa cartel operatives in early 2024. A weapon system capable of destroying commercial aircraft and military helicopters at ranges that would threaten any air operations conducted over cartel territories. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel has been confirmed to possess American-made Javelin anti-tank systems that can destroy armored vehicles at distances exceeding 2 miles, indicating that cartels have acquired some of the most advanced portable weapons systems in the world through networks that remain largely unidentified by intelligence agencies. These surface-to-air capabilities pose direct threats to helicopter operations that would be essential for any American military intervention, as rotary-wing aircraft provide the mobility and firepower projection necessary for operations in Mexico's mountainous terrain and dense urban environments. The presence of Stinger missiles in cartel hands means that American helicopters would face the same threats that have challenged military operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other conflict zones where portable air defense systems have proven effective against conventional military forces. Anti-tank systems create similar challenges for ground operations as they can eliminate the armored vehicles that American forces would rely on for protection and mobility during extended operations in hostile territory. Cartel use of drones, explosives, and advanced technologies has evolved rapidly as these organizations adapt military innovations from conflicts occurring worldwide and apply them to their operations against rival cartels and government security forces. Cartels regularly employ drones to deliver explosives during assassination campaigns and terror operations, demonstrating tactical capabilities that mirror those developed by military forces in Ukraine, Syria, and other contemporary conflict zones. These drone operations reveal sophisticated coordination and technical expertise that extends beyond simple criminal activities into military-style operations that require specialized training, equipment maintenance, and operational planning typically associated with conventional armed forces. The explosive devices employed by cartels have increased dramatically in both sophistication and frequency, with their use of remote violence doubling compared to previous years, particularly in the states of Michoacán, Guerrero, and Guanajuato, where territorial conflicts have intensified. Cartel bomb-making capabilities include drone-delivered charges specifically designed for targeted assassinations, military-grade grenades acquired through trafficking networks, homemade explosive devices constructed with commercial materials, and improvised landmines that create area denial capabilities similar to those employed in conventional warfare. These explosive capabilities allow cartels to project force over extended distances while minimizing their own personnel exposure. Tactics that complicate military operations by creating persistent threats across wide areas. Training and tactical capabilities of cartel fighters have evolved to levels that approach those of conventional military forces, as these organizations recruit former military personnel and employ training programs that develop advanced combat skills among their membership. Many cartel operatives receive instruction in urban warfare techniques, advanced marksmanship, explosives handling, and small unit tactics from trainers who possess experience in legitimate military forces or international conflicts. The tactical proficiency demonstrated by cartel forces during confrontations with Mexican security forces reveals coordination and discipline that exceeds what criminal organizations typically possess, indicating systematic military-style training programs that prepare fighters for sustained combat operations. The flow of American weapons into Mexico has created a heavily armed adversary that possesses equipment originally manufactured for American military and law enforcement agencies, with estimates indicating that between 200,000 and 500,000 firearms cross the border southward annually through trafficking networks that Mexican authorities describe as the Iron River. Mexican government officials estimate that between 70 and 90% of weapons used in crimes within Mexico originated from illegal trafficking from the United States, creating the situation where American military forces would potentially face their own equipment in the hands of cartel opponents. This weapons flow includes not only small arms, but also specialized military equipment that requires technical expertise to operate effectively, indicating that cartels possess both the financial resources to acquire such equipment and the personnel capable of employing it tactically. Intelligence networks maintained by cartel organizations provide them with capabilities to detect incoming military operations that rival those of legitimate intelligence agencies, as these networks include informants within Mexican government agencies, communication intercept capabilities, and surveillance systems that monitor government and potential foreign military activities. Cartel intelligence operations have demonstrated ability to penetrate Mexican military and police organizations at levels that provide advance warning of planned operations, while their financial resources allow them to maintain extensive networks of paid informants who report on unusual government or foreign activities in their territories. The ability of cartels to blend with civilian populations and employ human shields represents one of their most significant tactical advantages, as these organizations operate within communities where they provide employment, social services, and protection that creates complex relationships with local populations. Cartel members often live among civilian families and conduct their operations from residential areas, commercial districts, and community facilities that would be difficult for American forces to target without causing significant civilian casualties. This integration with civilian populations allows cartels to move personnel and equipment through areas where American forces would face significant constraints in their rules of engagement, while also creating opportunities for cartels to use civilian casualties for propaganda purposes. These military capabilities represent only one dimension of the challenges that American intervention would face, as the economic and diplomatic ramifications of military action could prove even more devastating than the tactical obstacles presented by cartel arsenals. Economic and diplomatic consequences. Trade relationships worth approximately $800 billion annually would face immediate devastation as military intervention severed the economic integration that has made the United States and Mexico fundamentally interdependent across virtually every sector. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement that replaced NAFTA in 2020 created integrated supply chains and zero-tariff arrangements that military action would immediately disrupt, affecting Mexico's position as one of America's top 3 trading partners alongside Canada and China. This relationship proves particularly critical for American consumers who rely on Mexican imports for roughly half of their fresh fruits and vegetables, while Mexico serves as the largest market for American agricultural exports that support millions of jobs across rural America. Supply chain disruption would impact American businesses operating in Mexico across industries that have invested hundreds of billions of dollars in manufacturing facilities, distribution networks, and joint ventures, depending on stable cross-border operations. The automotive industry faces particular vulnerability as American manufacturers have established integrated production systems where components cross the border multiple times during manufacturing processes, creating dependencies that military intervention would immediately sever. The electric equipment sector has similarly integrated operations where American companies rely on Mexican facilities for cost-effective production, serving both domestic and international markets. American businesses operating in Mexico would confront immediate security costs and operational disruptions that could force many companies to abandon their investments entirely if military operations create persistent instability. The American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico represents companies that have invested extensively in Mexican operations and would face difficult decisions about whether to maintain operations in a country where American military forces are conducting combat operations. These businesses would need to invest significantly more in security measures while confronting the possibility that Mexican authorities might restrict their operations or impose regulatory barriers in retaliation for American military action. Mexico possesses substantial economic leverage that it could deploy in retaliation against American military intervention, including its cooperation on migration enforcement that has proven essential for American border security efforts. The Mexican government has been preventing migrants from reaching the American border through enforcement operations that reduced crossings by more than 60% between December 2023 and June 2024, cooperation that Mexico could immediately terminate if military intervention occurs. The loss of Mexican migration cooperation would likely result in massive increases in border crossings that would overwhelm American border security capabilities and create domestic political crises that could exceed the problems military intervention was intended to solve. Mexican economic retaliation could include tariffs and non-tariff barriers against American products that would harm American exporters, while potentially disrupting energy cooperation that provides essential resources for American consumers. Mexico could impose restrictions on American companies operating in Mexico that would force them to choose between maintaining their Mexican operations or supporting American military action, creating political pressure within the United States from business interests that oppose intervention. The Mexican government could also restrict cooperation on energy exports and other critical resources that American industries depend on for their operations. International diplomatic fallout from unilateral American military action in Mexico would likely result in widespread condemnation from allies and international organizations that view such operations as violations of international law and Mexican sovereignty. Article 2.4 of a United Nations Charter prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, while Article 51 allows self-defense only. In response to armed attacks, that drug trafficking does not constitute under international legal frameworks. European allies and other democratic nations would likely view American military action in Mexico as setting dangerous precedents that could justify similar interventions by other countries against cross-border criminal activities. The precedent established by American military intervention in Mexico would fundamentally alter international norms regarding sovereignty and cross-border law enforcement, potentially encouraging other nations to justify military operations against criminal organizations operating across their borders. Countries facing similar challenges with transnational criminal organizations could cite American action in Mexico as justification for their own military interventions, creating a global precedent that undermines the principle of state sovereignty that has governed international relations since the end of World War II. This precedent could particularly affect regions where multiple countries face cross-border criminal challenges, potentially leading to a proliferation of military interventions that destabilize entire regions. Regional instability could extend far beyond Mexico, as other Latin American countries respond to American military action by reconsidering their own relationships with the United States and potentially aligning with countries that oppose American intervention. Countries throughout Latin America maintain historical sensitivities about American military interventions that date back over a century, and military action in Mexico could trigger broader regional opposition to American influence and cooperation. The precedent could also encourage other countries to develop their own military capabilities for cross-border operations, potentially leading to arms races and regional conflicts that would require ongoing American military involvement to manage. The domestic economic costs of sustained military operations in Mexico would likely reach hundreds of billions of dollars annually based on the expenses of previous American military interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan that consumed trillions of dollars over 2 decades. Military operations require extensive logistical support, personnel deployment, intelligence gathering, and infrastructure development that create ongoing budgetary commitments that persist long after initial operations conclude. The costs would include not only direct military expenses, but also the economic disruption caused by damaged trade relationships and reduced economic cooperation between the two countries. Military intervention could paradoxically worsen the drug crisis by disrupting established trafficking patterns in ways that increase rather than decrease the availability of dangerous substances in American markets. Fentanyl production facilities are relatively simple to construct and can be quickly rebuilt after destruction, while the elimination of cartel leaders has historically resulted in increased violence as rival organizations compete for control of lucrative trafficking routes. American military counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan over 2 decades, including extensive bombing of drug production facilities, produced minimal lasting impact on drug availability while consuming enormous resources that could have been deployed more effectively through other approaches. Economic modeling conducted by trade associations and academic institutions indicates that military intervention could ultimately cost American taxpayers and consumers more than the current crisis through trade disruption, military expenses, and economic retaliation that would reduce American purchasing power and economic growth. The American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico has stated that military intervention would harm both economies and fail to address the real challenges of security, migration, and drug trafficking, while creating new problems that would require additional resources to address. The typical American household could lose approximately $1,200 in purchasing power through trade disruption and retaliatory measures, while Mexican economic decline could reduce their gross domestic product by 4% and create conditions that actually increase rather than decrease the incentives for drug trafficking and illegal migration. Despite these overwhelming economic and diplomatic costs, the political momentum driving America toward military intervention continues to accelerate as domestic pressures and institutional forces push policymakers beyond the point where rational cost-benefit analysis can influence the points of no return processes. Multiple trigger events and institutional developments have pushed American military intervention in Mexico beyond policy debate into operational inevitability, where military action appears increasingly unavoidable rather than merely possible. The formal designation of Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations established legal frameworks that eliminate traditional barriers to military intervention while creating institutional pressure within government agencies to utilize the authorities such designations provide. The Matamoros kidnapping and murders crossed thresholds that previous cartel violence had never approached, generating political momentum that makes military inaction potentially more damaging than the risks associated with intervention itself. Domestic political pressures have reached levels where policymakers face greater career risks from appearing weak on cartel violence than from supporting military action that could produce unintended consequences, including economic disruption and international condemnation. Congressional representatives from both parties report that constituent pressure for military intervention has exceeded anything they experienced following major terrorist attacks, with phone systems overwhelmed by demands for immediate military retaliation against cartel organizations. The political calculus has shifted fundamentally as supporting military intervention has become safer than advocating for continued diplomatic approaches that voters increasingly view as ineffective responses to escalating cartel violence. Expert predictions regarding intervention timelines have converged around a narrow window between March and June 2025, when several factors will force definitive decisions about military action rather than allowing continued policy ambiguity. Intelligence officials predict that cartel violence will continue escalating during this period as organizations compete for territorial control in anticipation of potential American military intervention, creating additional incidents that could serve as catalysts for immediate military response. Military planners have indicated that operational preparations will be complete by early spring, eliminating logistical barriers that currently provide justification for delaying intervention decisions. Several scenarios could serve as the final catalyst that transforms military intervention from potential policy option into immediate operational necessity, with each scenario representing conditions that would make political inaction impossible for any administration. A major terrorist attack against American targets conducted by cartel operatives would immediately trigger military retaliation under existing counterterrorism authorities without requiring additional congressional authorization or extended policy deliberation. Large-scale cartel attacks against American civilians in Mexico that produce casualty numbers exceeding previous incidents would create political pressure that no administration could resist while maintaining domestic credibility. The kidnapping or execution of American government personnel, including diplomats, military advisors, or law enforcement officers, would represent direct attacks against American sovereignty that historically have triggered immediate military responses regardless of broader policy considerations. Drug trafficking incidents that result in mass casualty events within the United States, particularly those affecting children or occurring in politically sensitive locations, would generate public outrage that makes military retaliation politically inevitable. Cartel attacks against American infrastructure, including border facilities, communication systems, or transportation networks, would constitute acts of war that require military rather than law enforcement responses. Public opinion has shifted dramatically toward supporting military intervention, as polling data shows sustained majorities favoring targeted strikes against cartel leadership, while growing minorities support broader military operations, including ground forces deployment. The transformation in public sentiment reflects the accumulation of cartel violence incidents that have convinced Americans that diplomatic approaches have failed completely and that military solutions represent the only viable remaining option. Social media amplification of cartel violence imagery has created emotional connections between American citizens and victims that generate persistent pressure for retaliation that traditional diplomatic responses cannot satisfy. Media coverage has played a crucial role in creating pressure for military action by consistently framing cartel violence as acts of war rather than criminal activities, while emphasizing American casualties and cartel military capabilities that justify military rather than law enforcement responses. Television networks regularly feature military experts discussing intervention options while avoiding diplomatic specialists who might advocate for non-military solutions, creating information environments that normalize military intervention as reasonable policy option. The media emphasis on cartel brutality and American vulnerability has generated public expectations for decisive government action that diplomatic approaches cannot fulfill. Political rhetoric from both parties has escalated to levels where military intervention has become the mainstream position, while diplomatic engagement has been marginalized as appeasement that enables continued cartel violence against American citizens. Republican leaders have consistently advocated for immediate military action, while Democratic officials have moved toward supporting targeted strikes that they previously opposed, eliminating bipartisan restraint that historically limited military interventions. The rhetorical escalation has created political momentum where supporting military intervention demonstrates strength, while opposing it suggests weakness that politicians cannot afford during election cycles. Institutional momentum within government agencies strongly favors military solutions, as Pentagon planners have developed comprehensive operational plans, while State Department officials have been excluded from key policy discussions about cartel intervention. Military and intelligence agencies have invested substantial resources in surveillance operations, target development, and operational planning that create institutional interests in implementing the strategies they have developed. CIA and Pentagon officials regularly brief senior policymakers about military options, while diplomatic alternatives receive minimal attention in policy discussions. The current trajectory has made diplomatic solutions increasingly difficult to achieve, as the terrorist designation of cartels has eliminated legal frameworks that previously supported cooperative law enforcement approaches, while cartel violence has continued escalating despite Mexican government efforts. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has stated that Mexico will never accept American military presence on its territory and emphasized that sovereignty is not negotiable, creating fundamental disagreements between the two governments that diplomatic engagement cannot resolve. The deterioration of bilateral cooperation has reduced opportunities for collaborative approaches that might address cartel violence without requiring military intervention. International factors that could prevent military escalation include European allies threatening to impose economic sanctions against the United States if military intervention occurs without United Nations authorization that Mexico opposes. Canadian officials have privately warned that military action in Mexico could destabilize the entire North American region while potentially triggering refugee crises that would affect all three countries. However, these international pressures have proven insufficient to override domestic political momentum that favors military intervention. Expert assessments increasingly conclude that the United States has crossed the point where military intervention becomes unavoidable as political, institutional, and operational factors have aligned to create conditions where intervention appears inevitable rather than merely possible. The combination of legal authorities, operational capabilities, political pressure, and institutional momentum has created a trajectory toward military action that would require extraordinary circumstances to reverse. Intelligence analysts predict that the question has shifted from whether military intervention will occur to when such operations will begin and what form they will initially take. The convergence of these factors suggests that America may be approaching a threshold that few citizens fully comprehend. Military intervention appears increasingly likely as the institutional machinery of war has been set in motion through terrorist designations, expanded surveillance operations, and comprehensive operational planning that mirrors preparations preceding previous American interventions. The Matamoros incident provided the political catalyst that transformed fringe military proposals into mainstream policy discussions, while the formal designation of cartels as terrorist organizations eliminated legal barriers that previously constrained military action. Pentagon planners have developed targeting packages and operational strategies that await only final authorization, while CIA surveillance operations have gathered intelligence necessary for immediate implementation. The current trajectory suggests that America may be approaching its next military conflict without most citizens recognizing how close such operations have become to reality.